All right, so as this is loading up, I'll tell you, one of the things Maggot didn't mention is that I also worked at Metro Vancouver for over a decade on a lot of these issues that Bill is talking about. So I've prepared my presentation to integrate the analysis of what One Planet Living could potentially look like, or what it would need to look like in Metro Vancouver if we were actually going to be sustainable, as well as the history of how we have tried, at least in my short time, because we are here with venerated people who've been doing this stuff for 30, 40 years in the city and in the region. But during the last 20 years, I will give you a quick synopsis of some of the things that I know that Metro has been trying to move forward on this agenda, what's worked, what hasn't, a bit of a retrospect on closing the sustainability gap.
It's not on the stick.
Yeah, it's on the stick.
There it is. It took a minute.
Published works.
Okay.
Sorry, people. Okay, perfect. So it's a bit of a personal retrospect. So here's Vancouver's sustainability gap. Choose Metro, choose the city. It's pretty much similar. Metro's a little bit bigger than the city of Vancouver. So where we're at is almost 4.5 global hectares of ecological footprint demand on nature services. So if we look at the biocapacity supply and we take that in terms of what we demand, instead of 1.7 ecologically productive hectares of average global productivity per person, we're actually consuming closer to 5. In fact, we might be closer to 7 if we include national government services to which all Canadians benefit but are outside the scope of just the city. So this is based on our urban metabolism in this region. We're still far and away above what we would need to get to down here, which is that 1.7 per capita. That's what nature can supply. This is what we demand, and the difference is the sustainability gap that we need to close if we're going to be ecologically sustainable. So my story starts with the narrative of Clouds of Change, 1990, and as a young master's student doing my master's thesis under Bill's supervision, at the same time this concept of ecological footprint was being developed, I did a quick retrospective 4 years after the fact of how far did the city of Vancouver actually get with implementing Clouds of Change? And you know, in 1994, I was so naive. I thought, well, they should have had this wrapped up by then. I mean, it should be easy peasy, right? No way. So that's how I cut my teeth in this world. And in 1995, based on my research, I was hired as Metro Vancouver's first air quality planner in charge of climate action. So back then, we were really focused on the health impacts of common air contaminants, and everything we were doing around climate change, although we knew then it was a very significant issue, we had to locate as co-benefits to air quality management, right? We didn't really have any regulations, although science was already saying then 80% reductions in emissions is what we needed to target on. I remember Jerry Scott from David Suzuki Foundation pounding his fist, 80%, 80%. We couldn't really get past 20% as a discussion point, and that's what the International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives was recommending, and the Federation of Canadian Municipalities here in Canada was supporting as well. And so in 1996, we formed the Regional and Local Government Working Group on Climate Change. Started with 3 municipalities, the City of Vancouver, the City of Delta, and Greater Vancouver Regional District, a local government. And from there, we eventually got all 21 members of the region to join this Regional Local Government Working Group on Climate Change, which was looking at setting reduction targets, creating inventories of their emissions, creating action plans. And this whole debate on 20 versus 80, some of the municipalities were really hesitant, even, like, forget 80, even to commit to 20% emission reductions. I think it was by below 1988 levels at the time. And so the dialogue was, well, they're voluntary targets, an indication of where you could get to, you don't have to. And so we moved on that voluntary approach, developing regional community energy plans and regional energy plans, and identifying some of the key strategies that have now become, I think, some of the things we celebrate as part of Vancouverism, our green building strategy, for example. We knew that we knew the relationship between land use and transportation, but buildings were an equally big source of greenhouse gas emissions in this region as much as transportation. We had nothing doing with buildings. And there's an interesting story which I'll tell as I move through. Then in 2000, we launched the Air 2000 initiative because we realized that even though we were understanding what was driving our emissions, we had no programs in place to help the municipalities reduce their emissions, right? So all of the emphasis was on land use planning and transportation, but there was nothing around utilizing building codes, driving the Model National Energy Code into the BC adoption mechanism. So we started to focus on where municipalities could make big inroads, and one of them was on green buildings. And many of you will think about green buildings as an initiative to design green buildings. But I can tell you, because I worked with Thomas Mueller, who's now the president of the Canada Green Building Council and founded it. When we started this initiative, we were looking at the retrofit of buildings. 1999, 2000, it's still the hardest nut to crack. At the time, we were very actively opposed by BOMA, who ironically now is one of the biggest advocates for increasing the energy efficiency of existing buildings. But back then, it was too early. The economics weren't there. There were split incentives between what the owners were achieving, where they could just pass on their costs to renters through triple net leases. So there was really no appetite for it, and it's still something we're trying to get to today. We also looked at EcoSmart concrete, high volume fly ash concrete, because municipalities use so much concrete, trying to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions associated with 1 ton of concrete, 1 ton of greenhouse gas emissions associated with its production. So using different kinds of cementing materials, that was a big initiative for us, and initiating these eco-industrial networking projects down in North Vancouver, in Big Bend, in Burnaby, and in Richmond. Some of these things had some traction, some of these things didn't. So along came an opportunity. We had a new CAO, and he was really struggling with the intransience of some of the municipalities around the Livable Region initiative. And he thought that sustainability might be a way to bring these municipalities together in a more collaborative manner. And so we talked about the difference between a livable region, which Bill mentioned, and the transition to a sustainable region. And so the Sustainable Region Initiative was born in 2001, trying to revitalize, from a political perspective, municipalities coming together to solve their issues, which has always been the hallmark of sustainability in this region, collaborative model. For me, we were shifting from an emphasis on supply as a regional utility to demand management. We were doing a great job with the land use transportation. Transportation demand management had always led. In fact, I would argue that the Livable Region Strategic Plan was the blueprint for sustainability in this region. It had all of the same messages and concepts right there. So all we were really doing was a different shade of green, maybe a bit of a deeper shade of green, trying to tweak some things, and introducing different pricing mechanisms now. Instead of getting your water for free, we did actually try to create bulk financing, so the more you use, the more you pay. Hydro was starting to move this way already, leading with energy efficiency. So the shift to demand management, I think, is one of the biggest psychological shifts that the region was making as a regional utility provider for sustainability. Another interesting one that's a success, this would be a failure, the Partners Committee. So the region realized it only is really a utility. It has some land use persuasion with municipalities through the growth management strategy, but really it's a utility. So in order to get to sustainability, to address social equity issues, economic development issues, we needed to collaborate with other partners. And so the region began an outreach campaign working with the BC Business Council, the United Way, BC labor organizations, to come together in a consortium to begin to solve bigger regional initiatives. And I think that was a very, very progressive move on the part of the region. It didn't last that long, 3 years, it carried on. BC Hydro was also at the table, and ironically, as momentum started to grow with the Partners Committee, they started to push for rotating chairs and an agenda that might not have always, in fact, quite honestly, terrified some of the regional bureaucrats around where this might lead, because there's one thing we can do as a utility, but we can't take on an ever-growing mandate. So it was closed down quite intentionally. So I think that was a big loss. I think if we had continued with that Regional Partners Committee, we would be very far down the road on sustainability as a region, cohesive collaboration across organizations. Instead, we moved into the sustainability dialogues. So we repositioned those resources. And I think dialogue is important, but I don't think the dialogues have really led to the substantive changes that we would have needed to see if we're going to actually get to One Planet Living. And it wasn't until the adoption, and then the last thing, sustainability framework. I was very pleased to hear John mention that. It was a project that I worked on to create the sustainability framework, guiding principles to unite all the regional plans under sustainability. The first one came out in 2005. The most recent one, 2011. So it took 9 years for that most recent growth strategy plan to actually get adopted. So although collaboration is working in this region, there are definitely some hiccups and bumps along the way. And to illustrate that, all that voluntary work that I talked about in the mid-90s around greenhouse gas action management and plans and targets, not much progress. Not until the BC government in 2010 said, thou shalt. Now municipalities have set targets, they have action plans, they're not necessarily implementing them that effectively, although we have maintained the line on our transportation. You know, we haven't increased emissions that much from transportation. We've maintained the line on our buildings as well, although despite all the green that we've put in, the design of these buildings is high residential, multifamily unit buildings. They are no more efficient now than the single family homes in Vancouver. And that's because the envelope, the design, the glass cladding is very inefficient. So, you know, we have perpetuated some of these myths that high density multi-unit residential it should in theory be more energy efficient square foot per square foot. But if your design elements are inefficient, if your cladding and envelope is inefficient, you don't achieve much. So we've really flatlined mechanical systems, more efficient envelope, less efficient. So here's our emissions over 20 years and the forecast going out. We're not getting to one planet living. We did have a huge drop, and look at the numbers. What Metro actually attributes that to is the closing of Burrard Thermal. In fact, also with air quality, Burrard Thermal is our electricity generating plant. And with air quality too, the biggest gains we made, we have huge success in reducing our common air contaminant emissions. It was the closure of 2 out of 3 oil refinery plants in the region. So industry is a major player here, and despite everything we're trying to do with planning for compact mixed-use communities, which are important because it's helped us hold the line on emissions, what industry is doing is really driving this. And where we're going in the future with LNG and the port expansion and the carbon traders, that's the real game, I think. So here's our carbon gap. This is our City of Vancouver's emission inventory. This is if you included the ecological footprint, all the consumption, and all the food. And that's what IPCC says we need to get to. There's your 80% reduction. So we have this myth that we're sustainable, but there's really a schism in our metrics. Here we see in the ecological footprint, where are we demanding the most? From food mostly. So we have the ALR, but we really haven't addressed how our food choices and food production systems are driving our footprint. We have focused on transportation. We have now focused on buildings, but consumables, we still haven't made the shift to a conserver society or anything like that. This is what we need to get to for one planet living. You can see the biggest drop is in the energy consumption and a little bit in the food. So what does it look like? We'd have to make 86% of our trips by walking, cycling, and transit, and anything else would have to be zero emissions. We'd have to reduce our food waste post-purchase, like reduce that by 50%. Changing our diet is probably the biggest thing we could do to get to one planet living. Improving the energy efficiency in our buildings by 40%. We know we can do that. We've known for a long time we could do that, but we actually have to get on with it and get the design elements in sync with the mechanical systems, and reducing paper consumption by 50%. So that's not recycling more, that's just reducing consumption. And that one's a bit biased because of the way the footprint measures land and paper from wood forests. So thank you very much for your time.